I'm Scott L. Miller. This is my life living in Leon, Nicaragua. On our WhatsApp Expats of Nicaragua group this week, we had the discussion about libraries. Can you find them here in Nicaragua? And that brought up the topic of why don't you find very many of them here? And this is actually a really interesting opportunity to look at some cultural and historical differences between the region here in Central America and North America, for example, as libraries are something so just standard and normal and everyday and important in North America. You might be surprised to learn how rare you're going to come across them here in Nicaragua and across the region. Why could that be? What cultural historical factors could be leading to something so basic being so different? Well, we're going to talk about that right after the bump. When looking at libraries around the world, one of the things we kind of have to start with is why are they so popular in North America? Well, there's a lot of factors in North America that make them easily make a lot of sense. Partially, that's simply because of how old the United States and Canada are, that the time period when they were really establishing themselves as major cultural forces was around the same time that libraries were starting to be plausible to have in many different locations. Back in the old days, we're talking the 1700s and earlier, having a library was outrageously expensive, and it was generally something left for the super rich and for universities, which alone were pretty rich. And so libraries, because each book would have cost hundreds or thousands of dollars in today's money just to publish, it was pretty rare that you would have them. And you would limit access to them because it was very easy for someone to do a great deal of damage. And most people weren't really interested in the content of the books and were very unlikely to take good care of them. So you really had to watch over them, you had to monitor them, and they had to be centralized because they were such expensive resources. So in the old days, like in Europe, when we're talking in the 14, 15, 16, 1700s, having a few isolated major municipal or academic university-based libraries and a few very rich people having their own personal libraries, this was a normal thing. But in the Americas, they started building the idea of community libraries during a time period when we didn't already have those established old giant ancient libraries, and instead books were suddenly relatively cheap, and they were able to start putting them into all the cities across America. And as we know from modern times, quite often the US government and other governments as well, this is a normal thing, prop up private industries by throwing money into things that sound like they're doing something for the public. If you ever went to a library as a kid, if you're anywhere near my age, you went through the library and you often said to yourself, who's actually looking at any of these books? And I think you'll find in many cases, there were a few books that were very popular, but loads and loads and loads of books that nobody was ever going to look at all. So what was the purpose of having libraries full of these expensive resources if no one was going to be looking at them? The answer is actually very simple. Libraries functioned very heavily as a mechanism for propping up the American publishing industry. Of course, there's many books in libraries that are published other places, but the majority in American libraries were being published in America. And this coincides with the American education processes that for many generations and for definitely most of the 20th century taught that the act of something being published by a commercial publisher was itself proof that the contents of that book were to be considered as authoritative. This is something we were taught heavily during the education system of the 20th century. Every time you needed to provide a reference for something, you didn't have to prove that the source was reliable in any way whatsoever. You only had to prove that the source was a commercial publisher. That was considered the most important thing. The actual logic or facts or reasonable nature of the content of the book, not relevant. Whether the author was to be trusted, not relevant. Only that a publisher had put money behind it. So that we also saw the rise of libraries as a place to prop up publishing houses, not at all surprising. There was so much power in this that seeing this spread across America as a way to control media at the time, just like media is much controlled today through different digital means, absolutely expected. Just something that we don't often think about because we were taught so heavily that libraries were such a public service, and to some degree they were, that we don't question that there may have been a lot of additional factors driving why libraries were so popular. Now, there are other things about the American experience that make libraries very different there than in other parts of the world. One of them is that Americans, even quite some time ago, had cars and a lot of empty space between cities. This means that in order to have any type of resources for people who live in more rural communities or in small cities, you needed to have local libraries. Getting to major centralized municipal libraries, I've got some ants crawling across the lens, very, very difficult. But the average American found that driving to a library was incredibly cheap and accessible because Americans just so often had cars going back quite some ways. So this allowed for a promotion of the car and oil industries, whether that was intentional or just a result of how much those were already promoted and available. But it made for a perfect thing. When I was young, it was a normal thing to just hop in the car and travel quite some distance to go to a library. We would think nothing of doing that. To go to a bookstore and purchase those books would be impossible. Even finding bookstores for us was quite difficult, but libraries were much more frequent. I could get to 4 or 5 libraries before I got, this is in travel, to a single bookstore growing up in America. And each of those libraries full of books that most people never used. Now, we had great systems for sharing books between libraries. They did a great job with what they had. They have so many factors that were so different than we experience other places. And because Americans were so affluent throughout the 20th century, still remain so today, there was plenty of time for reading books, so providing this generally form of entertainment. Of course, some books were research books and such in the libraries, but by and large, they're full of fiction and entertainment material. And so the libraries really functioned as kind of like low-cost television viewing spaces. And even when I was a kid, they were a place to go and use computers. They were often a place to go read newspapers. They were often treated as reading rooms. And that's why someone from the community was interested in finding some. They were thinking that here in Nicaragua, there may be these reading centers where it's just a nice place to go and hang out and have some quiet time away from a hotel room where you could hang out and spend some time just reading or surfing the internet or whatever. But we generally don't find libraries here in Nicaragua. They're very uncommon. They do exist, of course, but in all my time here, I've seen a few on a map. I've never encountered one that was actually open in all the time I was here, and I've never met a person who'd be interested in going to one. That's really important. Now, of course, because they don't exist, why would anyone think of going to one? That makes sense. And as Americans, with my kids having lived in the United States, they're only teenagers now. So when they were younger, at more of go-to-library ages, more like late elementary and early middle school, we did go to libraries from time to time, and we did really like the resources that the American libraries provided to us. We liked being able to borrow books. We liked being able to borrow media from there back when that was a big thing. Like being able to go to events that happened at the library. We used to go to craft things there. It was very, very nice. We used to go to Farmers Branch and Carrollton. They went to a lot of their homeschooling activities there. Loads of community educational resource stuff is done at libraries. Really great stuff. So it was really nice that those things existed for them. But here in Nicaragua, we find a lot of those factors are very different. So why today would we not likely find libraries here in Nicaragua? So let's start at the very basics. A library requires the purchasing of a lot of books. In the United States, this makes sense because you have an incentive from the publishing houses to go out and buy their books because it supports the publishing houses. It's a way to move money from the taxpayers into the pockets of those who own big, rich companies. Very, very normal things. We expect to see that. Here in Nicaragua, there aren't publishing houses owned in Nicaragua. So if they were to do the same thing with taxpayer dollars, which there's a lot fewer of, that money would flow out of the country and support American and foreign publishing houses rather than Nicaraguan ones. So there isn't that internal GDP incentive to help create a local publishing industry by putting that money in. It just wouldn't work that way. It doesn't make sense. So that's a major incentive that isn't there. Second thing is that Nicaraguans do not broadly have cars. We do have great public transportation, but it's really painful to just go borrow a book, to, hop a bus in a rural community, ride into the city, take the city buses, go around, get to the book, borrow it, and go back again. If you're driving past, like Americans often are, and just swinging into your local library, it's a really simple thing to do, and still we don't do it very often. But for a Nicaraguan, it would not make any sense. That is a big commitment of time. It is a small commitment of money, but important importantly, many Nicaraguans don't have a lot of excess money. Even that 25 cents or 50 cents to go in on a bus would be an amount of money that would be very questionable whether that was worth spending to go borrow a book. And in the United States, we always have these fines for not returning a book on time. Well, many Nicaraguans would not necessarily have the flexibility to just be able to drop everything at their job and go return a book, especially if they don't have the money for the public transportation or their schedule changed or whatever. And so any potential fines on that book would not be something that they would want to take on as a risk. That would impact them too much. The value of an individual book in print form is much higher as a percentage of their income as a job. A book may cost today $10 for a reasonably large novel. If it's not quite that much, or maybe it's more at this point, that's a really big deal when you're bringing in $200 or $300 per month. For an American who's bringing in $2,000 or $3,000 per month, a $10 book that you can very trivially return and is just not a big deal. But for a Nicaraguan, that is a much bigger deal. So they're much less likely to do that or want to do that. There's also a lot less free time. Even though Americans work very long hours, Nicaraguans also typically work very long hours when they're working, often 6 days a week, and they have a lot of things that they need to do on their day off. So the amount of time that they would sit around reading a book, just much less in general. Because of the weather, because of the very warm temperatures, books don't survive as well. People don't want to keep books around. It's much harder to control the environment for them. For Americans, it's generally so easy to keep books safe. You don't think anything of it. But here, the humidity might, do a lot of damage just to the paper. And, we have lots of storms and things. People have open houses. Very few people who are on low income have fully sealed houses. Like, it's just a completely different scenario. But now the real thing, the thing that's so different in the United States, yes, there's things you can do to get low-cost books, and many of us do things like have subscriptions to Audible to get books on books on CD, to get audiobooks. A lot of people have Kindle Unlimited to basically have a library that's digital. For many of us, we want to use devices like Kindle. Others want to use paper books, of course. Lots of people love paper books, even if they're borrowed paper books. Some people like them because they're borrowed, right? There's a lot of different ways that people like to consume books. And in the US, we generally have the luxury of being able to do whatever it is we feel like. We have many, many different ways to get books, physical or digital, at relatively low prices, often because we're getting lots of them, so we can pay for them in bulk. Here in Nicaragua, yes, many of those same mechanisms would exist. We are here in Nicaragua, and we do have Kindle Unlimited. And I do have Audible. I have the Platinum subscription and get a couple books every month, and I keep them in a giant library, and I can listen to them anytime I want, and it's a well-managed system. Although, hey, Audible, you could improve that interface for finding books a little bit. That's pretty rough still after all these decades. But for Nicaraguans, they have no need to pay for books. Their books are available for free. They don't need a library website to do that stuff, and they don't need their tax dollars to go into it to do that stuff. Because of the way that copyright and digital data sharing works here, they don't have the need to go out and go through those formal processes to get books. They can go on websites and simply download the books that they want. And I know people who are avid readers here and want to read very serious books. They're looking for important literature. They're looking for self-help books. They're looking for history books and so forth. And they just go to websites, look up the books that they want, and download them in digital format. And it costs them nothing, and they're able to get them immediately. This is a really big deal. Every Nicaraguan, even small children, generally have their own digital devices, their own phones, and in some cases tablets, and once in a while laptops and such. So the availability of a way to read a book already exists. No one's getting devices just for reading. You're not going to see any Kindle devices down here. I have never come across one, even with a tourist. And I love Kindle devices. I'd love to have one, but I've never seen anybody that's actually using one here. But everyone has a device on which they can read books for free. And Nicaraguans have lots of ways to get books for free. Because they don't have to pay for the book, and they don't have to pay for the travel to go to a library to borrow the book, and they don't have to do any special setup to use a library. There's just a lot of mechanisms that in America seem like, well, it makes it a little bit cheaper, it makes it a little bit easier, you can do all these different things. Here, they've already gone past that in ease of use and low cost, that any amount of using a library would be a luxury. And so while as Americans, we are conditioned, and it's true for us, that libraries were a public service that made access to media and in some cases education very low cost and accessible to essentially all Americans. Yeah, there's always someone for whom it was tough, and I grew up in one of the tougher spots and it still wasn't hard for me. The 99% of Americans, libraries made the world more accessible, and it did help level the playing field for all but the absolutely most destitute Americans. But for Nicaraguans, it wouldn't do that. They've already leveled the playing field in this particular instance, and libraries would really just be a tax on everyone, with benefits only really available to the rich. Someone who is rich enough to have idle time, but also be able to afford the risk of not being able to return books and being able to waste the time to go travel somewhere to get a physical book instead of just getting the free instant copy that they can have in digital form. Just all these factors that to Americans make it a public service here would make it a luxury, a chance to show off that you could waste money because you didn't want to put up with a free instant digital copy. It's a really weird way to look at that factor, that's why libraries don't exist here. They wouldn't provide a public service. You wouldn't get more education because of it. You wouldn't level the playing field because of it. You wouldn't use tax dollars to support private business because of it. And the one thing that would be nice is if you do have librarians who provide educational resources, they could be paid out of public tax dollars, creating jobs, if there was an excess of tax dollars to do that with. But that requires that there's an excess of tax dollars. In the U.S., there's a massive excess of tax dollars. They're always looking for ways to spend it. Generally goes into the military complex, but it can go any number of places, and creating jobs in places like libraries is a perfect, awesome way to do that. And library buildings often heavily contribute to the value of real estate within a town. And so it functioned in a lot of different aspects as a positive impact due to the excess of tax dollars that were able to be spent. In Nicaragua, everything's very lean. They don't collect very many taxes. And so putting that into building buildings that are not needed, creating jobs, they need to have discrete value. Once there's an excess of tax resources, creating jobs for librarians and library helpers and all that kind of stuff, that could be a great way to go. But that's a big economic change that needs to happen in order for that to become an option, let alone the priority. Because even if they have those resources, should they put them more into direct teachers? Should they put them into universities? Should they put them into roads or to ports or to trains or to parks or who knows what? There's all these different places that they have to choose between when spending tax dollars. But with the U.S., we had enough to do everything because the country was so rich during the 20th century. So it's a completely different factor. And that, I think, is why you're really not going to find more than a handful of libraries across Nicaragua, and why people are in no hurry to go use them. They just don't understand what value they would present. We already have quiet places to go read. You can go sit in a coffee shop and do that more cheaply than being at a library. Man, you get the benefit of coffee. And they just don't want to have more things flowing through taxes when they don't need to. Thank you for joining me. Like and subscribe. If you'd like to help support the channel, you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Scott Allen Miller, and that comes directly to me. It's like Patreon. Help support the channel and the cameras and the software and all the things it takes to do this show. I'll be traveling this weekend up to the United States, so I'm getting the last of these few pre-travel episodes recorded and prepared for you guys. Get down in the comments, say hello, ask any questions that you have. I love getting feedback from you guys and being able to answer your questions. It gives me topics to talk about on the show. Get into our WhatsApp group. Links for absolutely everything are in the show notes, and I will see all of you tomorrow.